Will the Marvel Cinematic Universe ever be the same after the events of Captain America: Civil War? That is what we are going to dive into in today's special Civil War edition of Keepin' It Real. I am Terri Schwartz. I am joined by Eric Goldman and Joshua Yale. Jim Vejvoda, not with us today.
Jim?
Where's Jim? We're taking over the podcast. We're going off the rails. Things are going to get crazy. Obviously, this is, if we're talking about Civil War, full spoilers. If you haven't seen it yet, we're probably going to ruin it for you if you keep watching. We're absolutely going to. We're going to speculate beyond it. So get out of here if you haven't watched it yet. Bookmark it. Come back to it later. But let's get right into the thing that I think we all agree on is one of the coolest parts of this movie, the inclusion of Spider-Man.
Yes, it was so great. You know, the further they got into the movie, I was like, we haven't seen Spider-Man yet. We haven't seen it. You were mentioning just when it cuts to the Queen's thing, it's like, oh,
it's like hitting Joshua.
Yeah.
We were watching it together. I was like, it's happening.
Yeah. And he's just perfect. Like, it's just, you know, it's a small role, but it's also a substantial yet small role because he makes an impact in, you know, probably the 15 minutes or so that he's on the movie, maybe less than that. But no, it was, you know, we've seen a lot of Spider-Man in the movies, but I thought this was a great depiction. It makes me really excited to see his own movie. And just to know that he is being done by Marvel Studios now, or at least in cooperation with Marvel Studios for a solo movie, you just feel like, oh yeah, this is working really well.
Yeah, the movie took this sort of weird detour to include him, because like Tony goes and meets him, and he's like, hey, you want to come to Germany? But everything we got was so good, right? Even just like his sense of humor, like he's very soft-spoken, kind of naive, but very endearing.
Yeah.
And I liked how it kind of really quickly established, you know, just he had been Spider-Man for like I think they said 6 months, and he built the web shooters. And then as a scientist, like Tony Stark was very interested in that part of him, how he designed this and in his abilities. And speaking of his abilities, I love like during the fight, he was the strongest one there. Well, probably not strongest vision, but he said didn't seem to know it. He was just happy to be there.
Yeah.
He's like, what was it? Winter Soldier punched him and he grabs his arm and he's like, oh, this is awesome. Like, cool, he has a metal arm. As he's like bending it back with this immense strength, and just to see him do like his webbing and stuff like all over the place, and take to the sky and like crawling on Giant Man's lens. Just all these things were like so awesome that I'm so glad we finally got to see.
That was something that really struck me. He's by far the youngest of the Avengers, especially the ones who are in this movie, but you didn't feel that. Like, everything worked so well, the writing incorporated him into the storyline so well, and also I think he and Ant-Man are like the two characters who are geeking out the most for being called to be a part of it. Black Panther, a little more subdued, not quite as happy, you know, a bit more serious about his inclusion, but definitely I thought the Spider-Man element just gave so much more levity to the movie and something it really needed. I am curious how different Spider-Man Homecoming is going to be after this. Like, obviously it's established this relationship between Tony Stark and Peter Parker, and we can see this sort of mentor-mentee relationship. But, you know, given that he is a fairly young teenager, are we going to see a tone shift? Do you guys want to see a tone shift?
Well, I think they already open up that door. As you said, I mean, this is, you know, relatively speaking, it's, you know, a more sort of grim movie than a lot of the other Marvel movies, and Spider-Man is one of the ways that they put humor into it. So I think you'll definitely see that. I mean, yeah, they got his wit in the midst of battle, which I thought was great. And also, I thought it was really smart and, you know, shows sort of like Marvel knows what they're doing, that they got out of the way all of the hot Aunt May jokes that we've all been, like everyone's made for like a year now since Marissa Tomei was cast. It's like, no, have Tony say that, have him kind of being hitting on her. I thought that was great. It's like, you know, every joke that people were making on the internet, Tony Stark would make, and he does make in this movie.
I don't know, that's not my Aunt May. I don't like hot Aunt May. She needs to be an older, like elderly woman, because that's what makes her, that's like her character, I thought. Yeah. When it's the younger character, like you don't really need to like take care of and watch out for a woman who's like in her prime, you know?
I just feel like we probably shouldn't go too far down the Spider-Man web, but I think that because there's been so many movie Spider-Mans in the past decade plus, they really want to make things that are very distinctly, you know, different about this depiction. And I think, although I did see someone on Twitter make a great joke about Aunt May's been Benjamin Buttoning, showing like the three, you know, but it is by having her be like, you know, much younger than sort of traditional, and certainly in the Sam Raimi movies, it like just helps. I think they very distinctly want to have things that make it a separate type of story than what we've seen before.
And I think it's interesting that the 2 post-credit scenes that they have really lean into the characters that I think everyone could sort of predict people were going to be most excited about. You have the Black Panther Wakanda set up for what's to come. Is Winter Soldier going to be involved in any of that going forward? Very interesting. But also Spider-Man, like the movie ends with Spider-Man will return.
Yeah.
I think that everyone involved knew, especially once they started getting feedback from critics, we nailed this character. He's been done maybe the best that he's been done before. I don't know. We can debate about it.
Yeah.
We're doing a Spider-Man movie ranking coming up soon. But yeah, I think that they know that they should lean into that, and we're getting a Spider-Man movie next year.
And it was kind of weird how
Iron Man.
one of Winter Soldier's code words, his activation words, was homecoming.
Right.
I have an answer to this.
Oh, you
I have
do?
an answer to this. Okay, so I talked to the writers behind the movie, Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, and I said, should I be reading into this? Should we all be reading into this? And they said, just coincidence, nothing more to the Homecoming Winter Soldier activation references to the Homecoming title. I know. But then they started joking that like all future Marvel subtitles will just be like Winter Soldier code words going forward. Let's talk about the big airport fight scene, because this to me is the crowning achievement of this movie. This to me is also is the proof, because the same writers and directors are handling Infinity War, is that these people are going to be able to juggle a whole heck of a lot of characters and do it really well. Talk about your major impressions.
I mean, yeah, it was incredible. I mean, I am a lifelong Marvel Comics fan. I started reading Marvel Comics when I was like 6. And just to see this happening was amazing. I mentioned when it was just Jim and I doing Keepin' Real that this was the scene I was on set for when I did the set visit. And we only saw Team Cap running forward, and then we saw them filming the Widow Hawkeye fight and the Soldier Black Panther fight. But just seeing the parts we saw, I was like, I can't believe this is happening. Like, I can't believe it. And then when you watch that movie scene, it's such an accomplishment, because yes, just having them on screen is cool, but then everyone gets to like show off what makes them cool.
Everyone has their moment.
Everyone has their moment, and again, they nail that sort of Marvel interplay. I was saying that when Spider-Man has that sort of part in the underpass with Falcon and Winter Soldier, and it's so like fun, fast-paced, witty. You mentioned the part with with Bucky and Spider-Man in that part, and I think is it Falcon? One of them is like, "Who's that guy?" But it's just the whole, and then seeing the Ant-Man become Giant Man, there was just so much about it.
I love that moment.
Incredible.
Won that scene for
Yeah,
me.
it was huge applause at the screening I was at. Yeah.
Just like you said, just everyone getting a really cool moment, and things that we know these characters really well. Yeah, I was still surprised and just astonished, and just like Giant Man picks up, I think, like a truck and goes to hit War Machine with it, and War Machine just obliterates it with missiles and bullets and stuff. And I was like, oh my god, it was just one thing after another. It was just 20 straight minutes, I think it was like 20 minutes, something like that, of crowd-pleasing moments. It was just so much fun.
But moments that didn't feel unearned, right? It felt like we definitely built up to this place. And so a couple of touches that I really liked about that scene was you see these people fighting who are friends, like especially Black Widow and Hawkeye, and they're like, we're still friends after this fight, right? Like, we're doing this for Tony and Cap. Like,
Scarlet Witch was like, you're throwing your punches.
And also just some of the humorous moments, the Empire Strikes Back reference, like small things like that just completely capture, I think, what makes a Marvel movie a Marvel movie.
Yeah, but then I do think it's great that it's smart how it ends with War Machine being seriously hurt, because it's kind of like, okay, these are friends fighting each other. They are holding back to an extent. They're not out to kill, but they are very powerful beings. And so, like, if you keep fighting, something bad is going to happen. So I thought that was a great way to show, like, where this is going if they keep fighting.
And we'll get into the ending of the movie in a little bit and how it differs from the comics, but I do think that it's interesting that Rhodey didn't die, which I was a little concerned about in the trailers, but he did have serious consequences.
Yeah.
He's paralyzed now. And I wonder what weight is going to be given to that moving forward. Is Tony just going to make him a suit that's going to make everything better, and somehow it's going to look like pants and he can just walk around in like normal pants? Or is it going to be a major thing?
Yeah, I guess if you're paralyzed, it's good to be friends with Tony Stark, who probably is going to give you a walking pair of like mechanical legs or something like that that you can wear. But I do like that the fight like had consequences like that, because when in the comic book, and I guess the fight would be like I think it was in Central Park or something like that. In the comic book, they summon a like Thor clone that they made, and it accidentally kills superhero Goliath, and so that was sort of mirrored by Rhodey accidentally getting shot. So I was interested to see whether they were going to kill anybody in this movie or not, and they did not. But I still felt those consequences, so I feel like it was done really well. And also, Black Widow, that was her flip-flop scene, to where you kind of figured somebody in all of this chose the wrong side from the start. In the comic books, it was Spider-Man. For the most part, he was like the big one. But yeah, so to see Black Widow make her change, but then she was like kind of still on Iron Man's side after it. I thought that was kind of weird.
Mm-hmm. I did think, I thought it was good that, because going into this movie, I even had some debates with some friends of mine about this, because there were some people who were like, how could Widow ever side against Cap and Hawkeye based on like their friendships that have been very well established in these movies. So I was glad to see that while she sort of was on Tony's side of the debate, when that fight happened, by the end of it, she was like, but I guess, to answer your question, I don't think if it's 100% clear. I don't know that they ever realize at that point. Would Panther be the only one who would know maybe that she?
Because she was talking to Tony about it afterwards.
Oh, right.
There was a short scene, and I was like, wait, why are you still here with Iron Man if you just betrayed Team Iron Man?
Like, why isn't she locked up with the rest of them?
Yeah, or why didn't she escape and go help Cap or something?
Although isn't that kind of her final scene in the movie?
God, I can't remember.
I think it is.
Sort of.
Yeah.
This is sort of a big question to ask you guys, but where do you think the airport fight scene ranks in iconic MCU fight scenes?
I mean, I'm tempted to say it's the best superhero fight scene ever in MCU and aside. I mean, just on a pure spectacle level. Like, of course, there are more sort of like personal, intimate fights. Even the one at the end of this movie obviously has got more of like sort of a personal thing going on. But I mean, just as far as like pure, this is like comic book come to life. And that they described a lot, not just on that set visit, but if you read a lot of interviews with the Russos, they're like, this is our splash page, This is like them all running together. It's also the sequence that's in IMAX. So just on a pure like visual stimuli, taking the idea from comic books of all these heroes clashing, I think it's one of the best, maybe the best.
Yeah, I have to agree with pretty much all that. I don't have much to add. It really was comic books come to life. Like this is 12 movies now, and this is the 13th. We spent 12 movies establishing who these characters are, so we get to know them, understand their personalities, understand their abilities, and then we're putting them all in a room or in an airport together. On a tarmac together, and watching them go. And that was my favorite thing about this movie, is that the MCU has been established. There's no introducing new characters aside from Spider-Man.
And Black Panther.
And Black Panther, of course. So generally everyone had like a history. They knew each other. Like when Hawkeye went to rescue like Scarlet Witch, they already knew each other and things like that. I really enjoyed that this universe felt lived in. It felt established, and we get to see the heroes being who they are, interacting with each other. So just the airport scene was just the time to see them all interact and smash together in the most like glorious, awesome way possible. So I don't know where to rank it as far as like. Are we talking about just superhero action scenes? Like our fights can be against a villain?
Iconic, like big action set
I think the Spider-Man 2 Doc Ock Spider-Man train scene will always be like number one in my heart. But this one, yes, it's probably right up there with that. It's definitely at the top.
That's fair. So that's what we thought about the airport fight scene. It really blew us away. Where does it rank for you guys in these, big comic book action set pieces? Let us know in the comments and on Twitter. But Black Panther got his big debut in this movie, and we know he's getting a new movie soon. There's a lot of setup at the end of this film. What did you think about Black Panther in this movie? Did it sell you on him as a character?
Yeah, totally. He immediately had a very different presence, and I think that's great when you have so many heroes that he really stuck out. He's very, very like quiet but very confident, and he also was like a very passionate character. But he's also had a lot of weight on him because his father had just died, and that was really serious. Also, there's this great line. I couldn't tell if this is an Easter egg or not, but he was just
Death is not the end.
Yeah, he's like, death is not the end. And in the comic books, Black Panther eventually becomes the king of the dead and can commune with all past Black Panthers. So I was like, is that like a hint to that he's gonna like kind of have his father like in the spirit world again?
Right.
So
I
didn't
wouldn't
know.
be surprised if we see his father again in the movie
one way
in
or
some
the other.
capacity.
Yeah.
I feel like they're setting that up, even though he was pretty broken up about that death.
It might have just been another homecoming thing where it's all a coincidence. But yeah, so I hope but no, he was great. Physically, he was great. The chase scene where he was after Winter Soldier, pouncing over cars, digging his claws into hang on, and just one awesome thing after another. Towards the end of the movie, I feel like his importance sort of waned a bit as the plot took a weird turn that we'll talk about later that I didn't like very much. But as far as establishing him and getting people to like understand like what compels him to be the Black Panther, and then getting us excited for what comes next with that little teaser scene, I thought it was great.
Yeah, I know. I think, like you said, he brought a different energy to it. You know, he's got this sort of noble background, which we really haven't seen except for Thor. But Thor obviously also brings like sort of alien, so it's different. You know, this movie. It's another impressive thing about this movie because it was juggling so much, and only every character got their due, but sometimes they only had a few scenes to do it, or maybe a couple scenes. I felt like it gave you just enough to want to see more because we didn't see him or his father in Wakanda. We didn't see him among his people. But, you know, I thought that it was a great performance and sort of brought that sort of nobility and that strength. And he's a much sort of quieter and a very verbose group. He doesn't, you know, he's not like the one making witty one-liners. And that's great, especially in a movie that's introducing Spider-Man, because, you know, it shouldn't be like every character, including Black Panther, trying to outdo each other with witty lines. And yeah, physically, I'm glad you brought up that chase scene because that was a really cool scene on its own.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of things that, if done even slightly different, might not have worked as well as this did. I mean, you don't joke about the claws after you see this movie, right? You don't joke about that skin-tight suit. You know, like, this guy means business. And I think a lot of that is a credit to Chadwick Boseman, who plays him. I think he just nailed it. He probably had, like 10 minutes of total screen time. Like, he wasn't actually in the movie that much. He was in it more than Peter Parker, but he still wasn't in it that much. And to be able to really get across and convey everything that you guys said, I think is really impressive. And I think that he's going to be a really interesting character to get to know more of because, you know, Spider-Man had 5 other movies before this movie came out. Black Panther is a character a lot of people don't know about. They really do get to start from scratch and build him up to be whatever they want to be. And that's why I think that line about death is not the end is a hint at what's to come, as well as the ending of this movie. What do you guys think about the fact that Winter Soldier is left in Wakanda? Do you think he's like just being put away until like Cap wants to go see a movie with him or something, or do you think he's going to have a role to play?
I think he might. I think he'll probably have a role to play. I think that they're very smart about, like, when you think about Falcon showing up in Ant-Man and the fact that Tony will be in Spider-Man, and I don't think he'll have like a giant role, but I think, you know, a meaningful role. So I feel like with Black Panther, like, okay, they've established Claw as a potential villain, but they're going to want to have some other sort of Marvel hero presence, and that ending, the fact that he's like helping Steve and that Winter Soldier is there, I think it's very likely we see Winter Soldier in the Black Panther movie, or at least a strong reference to this having been there, and that can lead on to the, you know, Infinity War, where they're all going to team up again.
Hopefully.
Winter Soldier makes a great dramatic charge for Black Panther because obviously he did not kill his father, but he has that weight of every time he sees Winter Soldier, he's probably going to think of this is the man who was like framed to kill my father. So they actually have a weird bond in that way. And I could totally see at the end of the Black Panther movie, maybe not the end, or a particular scene, like there's like a break-in or something, or they sabotage Wakanda, and they're like, oh, we need some help, and then all of a sudden the Winter Soldier appears. And he's like dripping wet. Yeah, and he's like, I shouldn't have cut the power. And he like,
I does need dripping wet. I see that turning into like its own little like Black Panther Winter Soldier fan fiction. I don't know.
While we're talking Winter Soldier, I just gotta mention in the chase scene when he grabs the motorcycle handle and it just.
Cool.
Amazing. The Russos know what they're doing with an action movie. We obviously saw that in Winter Soldier, but they just upped it so much.
My wife and I both, I think that was a moment where both like looked at each other like,
our theater was just like, oh yes. And it's so funny because I don't know if you remember, there was like some skepticism when the Winter Soldier was coming out because the Russos were best known for Community
and Arrested Development.
Right. And then now look at them, they're just nailing it. So I'm really excited, especially once they get away from, I'm assuming they're getting away from the Earth set Marvel movies with Infinity War. I'm assuming at least one of them will be cosmic. I can't wait to see what they do in those sort of different jobs.
And they had Danny Pudi in Winter Soldier and Jim Rash was in Civil War, so we're going to get a Community cast member in each of their movies. So I'm very excited about
who do we want next? Which one do we want Joel McHale?
I want or Gillian Jacobs to be like a funny, sarcastic something, Kree.
I will just say that in a world with so many action movies that it is amazing to me that they came up with so many things in this movie that felt new and fresh like that. Like I've never seen that in a movie before with the motorcycle stunt, and especially just practical level things that wasn't really like a superhero stunt. Obviously, it takes a little super strength to do it, but I'm just so impressed that the movie just felt like seeing so many new things all at once.
That's because there's another conversation my wife and I had after the movie, because Winter Soldier, what they brought to Winter Soldier was a sort of grounded, much more like, I hate using the word gritty, it's very cliche, but still I'm going to use it.
It's like the 70s action.
Yeah, it just was a little more sort of like lived in and, felt like, you were sort of on the ground with these characters in a lot of the other Marvel movies, especially because Winter Soldier, no one had superpowers. I mean, Falcon's wings were kind of the most like out there thing, but it was still tech. So I was very curious to see what it would be like in this movie where they suddenly have Ant-Man and Vision and Scarlet Witch, but they still brought that grounded vibe to it. So even though they were dealing with some of these bigger characters, they still felt so real. And then you get a moment like that motorcycle stuff and these little touches that it's just, they're really great action directors.
Yeah.
So.
I was actually surprised. I know we've said this before that everyone kind of gets their moment, but in the beginning, I'd say the first half of the movie, Falcon actually is a bit of a scene stealer. He gets a lot of great moves.
And the banter between him and Winter Soldier is so good.
How they like hate each other.
Yeah.
That's so funny.
The two sidekicks of Steve Rogers.
Him using his wings.
So cool, the bulletproof wings.
Yes, and then Red Wing. I'm glad they put that in there.
Yeah.
Him telepathically talking to a Falcon was never going to happen, so I think that was a good compromise. But also Scarlet Witch, I thought, she was like an unexpected emotional core to the movie for me, because I feel like a lot of the debate was almost over her, because she's just so powerful, she's untrained, and they were blaming.
She causes it.
And the thing is that when she lifted that the crossbones exploding up, what else was she supposed to do there, right? It's like they were blaming that on her, but it's like it could have been worse.
Well, I think it's an interesting movie because both sides are right. As you go throughout the movie, you're sort of torn between the two of them. In a movie where two sides of a group that we like are fighting each other, it's a bit hard to have a villain come in and both not overpower the story, but also not seem so insignificant. And thus we get Baron Zemo. So what did you think about his inclusion in the story? Did it work for you? He was a lot smaller scale villain, more personal villain than any characters we've really had so far.
I thought that was a very wise decision, right? Is that while he is the one pulling the strings, that he is not, I'm going to conquer the world. He is by design, a innocuous presence, And ultimately, the reveal at the end is that it's like he's not trying to rebuild Hydra. He's not trying to,
take over the world.
There's no doomsday device.
Right.
He just wants to destroy the Avengers, and the fact that he succeeds is what I think is really cool about it. I mean, I agree with, I love the Marvel movies. I also agree with a lot of people that the villains is probably one of their most notable weak spots, with a couple of exceptions. I actually think Zemo is, one of their better ones as far as like motivation and, find kind of when you get that reveal about him. I'm actually really curious to rewatch this movie, which I'm doing tonight.
And tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after.
But I am curious to kind of sort of chart Zemo more, knowing what we know about him at the end, and like the reveal that the phone call from his wife, that it was a recording because she's dead.
Were those surprises to you? I thought him pretending to be the Winter Soldier and the fact his wife were dead were like sort of.
I didn't think about the wife thing because I thought I guess because I was taking it from a different approach, in that I thought it was like, oh, it's also an interesting approach if this guy who's destroying the Avengers has a wife
family.
and kids at home,
Gotcha.
because that would be interesting too. But my only big criticism about Zemo, and it's one that I also again want to analyze watching the movie, is it is a huge stretch that, from what we know, I'm trying to remember if we learned anything about what his career was, but some dude from Sokovia in 1 year got all this info and pulled off what he pulled off is kind of the biggest stretch to me. But as far as his motivation and his role in the movie, I like that a lot.
I mean, I didn't think it was that much of a stretch if that's literally all he's doing, and you get the sense he was a bit of a nefarious dude anyway. I agree with you that his motivations are better and not sort of as, two-dimensional as, say, Ronan in Guardians of the Galaxy or someone like that. But that said, I still think that Zemo is a pretty forgettable villain at the end of the day. Maybe it's simply because the movie isn't about him. Yeah. He's just sort of a guiding force in their story. But I think they did the best they could with him maybe, but he's still not anyone who I'm going to remember as we're looking forward. I'm looking back and I'm like, oh, Loki or something like that.
I guess I do think he did exactly what he's supposed to, though. He is a symbol at the end. Like, he's as much of a symbol as, the mother that Tony talks to.
Right.
It's like, it just turns out that he has decided, that it broke him to the point that he has now targeted the Avengers. So I that's why I kind of like that approach with him at the end. And I love that scene with him and Black Panther, actually, because it is like when he's just like, sorry about your father. Like, I think that's actually, and you kind of believe it, even though he is totally responsible for that, that it's like he's a man who's kind of broken inside. So I'm not saying like, oh my God, greatest character ever. I can't wait to see him return. But I think as far as like what this movie's about, he was very well done.
I mean, I can appreciate all of that, but he was the worst. I'm sorry.
As
he
a
was
character
the worst.
or as
Just
someone
everything.
with
He was like super paper thin. Like you said, only had like a year to do all this by himself. You think there'd be a lot of people who are equally disgruntled with the Avengers? A team would have made more sense. They could do all these things. The one man by himself, based off of highly coincidental things. That the Winter Soldier even has code words like that, and that Tony Stark's parents were killed by the Winter Soldier, and it happens to fall into place.
That was very neat.
Highly
that was a very
coincidental things happening, one thing after the other. He was barely in the movie. He was just the thinnest frame, like skeletal, like structure made of like brittle pasta. That was sort of the structure of why these heroes were fighting. I thought it would be better if they were just actually fighting, like in the comic book, where it's just a battle of ideals. Something horrible happens in the beginning. There's no mastermind plotting it all. I hate that one. Like, this was all my highly coincidental plan. Like, I don't like that, and I feel like this movie kind of like suffered for that because it didn't. In the end, like the last third, I guess, it became this like hunt for Zemo, and then there was obviously the reveal of the Winter Soldier killed Tony Stark's parents in that fight, but it didn't. I feel like I lost sight of the Civil War, of the registration argument. Like, I don't really know where that ends. And because they're so busy tying up these other plot lines in the end, we don't even kind of see the outcome. Like, what is the result? Like, what is the world like? Even in the comic book, there were a couple panels. I'm sorry I keep saying the comic book, but,
it's the source-ish material.
Is it the denouement, I believe you say, of it, sort of looking towards the future of what the world is like, even though you don't exactly see it yet. And, like, we even got Iron Man, doing a press conference with a bunch of registered heroes, and so, but we didn't get that this time.
There was no finite end.
Yeah, we don't feel an end to that argument. We didn't feel like anyone won the argument, nor do we see the result of him having won the argument.
Well, before we get too far into that, I want to know, obviously, Baron Zemo left us a little bit divided. We want to know what you guys think. Let us know. Our own civil war, so let us know in the comments. One thing I do think going forward, this is a movie that dealt so much with consequences, especially to final battle scenes that we've seen in previous movies. I'm really curious to see how future directors and writers in the MCU let that aftermath have a ripple effect. Because, to me, you can't have something like the end of the first Avengers where New York is destroyed, because this is all about the aftermath to that, right? You need to be conscious of that. You can't just have that happen and then go along as business as usual. Maybe you can do it in Guardians of the Galaxy or something, but to me it was a very self-reflective thing. So I'm interested to see how that moves forward. But the end of the movie really left us divided, I will say. We'll just say the final act, the third act of the movie. Joshua, you have thoughts. You have issues. Why don't you go first on this?
Well, I think I pretty much hit a lot of what I already said, but just to reiterate is that the movie started about, with the Registration Act, the Sokovia Accords, and with the heroes really debating this. But then at the end, it kind of got sidetracked when they went after Zemo, and then they found the other Winter Soldiers, and then they were all dead, and because he killed them, and then it didn't really culminate for me, and then it became this just huge, tragic misunderstanding of just that, Winter Soldier killed his parents, and he's obviously angry about that, even though he knows, if he were thinking about it on a cool head, that obviously it wasn't him. He knows how the Winter Soldier works.
I thought it was a little strange that Tony did quickly get so emotional about that and couldn't.
That's why I felt it was sort of like a cheap, emotional outburst that they kind of went for, because if you really thought about it, it wouldn't make sense for him to want to kill the Winter Soldier or rip his arm off. but I guess they wanted something there. They needed some last like twist at the end. I don't know. It just didn't like feel right to me that the movie took that weird turn, and it just didn't feel like it was in line with the rest of the movie.
But Eric, this worked for you. You liked it a lot.
So yes and no. It works more than it doesn't for me, because I think that, I guess one thing I was so happy about was that by the time they're going for Zemo, you're like, okay, this will be somewhat what we expect from these movies, which is, oh, Zemo's behind it. Now it's time for Iron Man and Cap to team up and stop Zemo. And I loved that it wasn't that, and that in fact it's like they're even have like a much more intense confrontation after that. Like I liked that they sort of undercut what seemed to be going into that direction of, oh, we do need to team up after all at the end of the movie. As for it being the reveal, I like it a lot, even though it does speak to the kind of weird place that these more MCU movies are, where this is its own movie, yet it's also part 13.
Right.
And so the fact that Winter Soldier killed Howard Stark was revealed to us and Cap in the Winter Soldier. And actually, I think the dialogue kind of perfectly, because the way it's shown by Arnim Zola is like, probably Winter Soldier did this. It's like, we would take care of things. But even Cap even says like, well, I didn't know, but I kind of did know, which is kind of what we felt. So it was a good payoff for that. But it, of course, wasn't from this movie. So it's
if
kind of...
you didn't know that.
Right. So it's kind of a weird thing that they're balancing. It still worked for me. And while you can say like, wow, they had really good security cams in this 1991 road, I went with it enough to be like, Tony just watched this man beat his father to death and choke his mother to death on camera. And of course the movie reminded you a lot about the loss of Howard Stark and the lost sort of collateral damage idea. So I was totally fine with all of that. The main thing I agree with you on, though, is I do think it did need that extra scene after we didn't get about the Sokovia Accords. I do think that should have come back in the fight, post-fight, because I was with the fight, I was with Zemo's reveal, what Zemo's motivations were, the final, and I thought the fight itself was super emotional. I love sort of the way that, that choreography was great, and the whole way we saw in the trailer of Bucky starting to tear out the chest piece, but then he blows off Bucky's arm, and then Cap, the way he beat Iron Man was really powerful, and I thought it felt sad, though that's, my father built that shield, all that. I do agree with you, though. After that, they should have kind of gone back to the Accords and seen the final. There needed to be a little more payoff of that, itself, what started it off.
To me, it lost a lot of momentum for me in the third act.
Mm-hmm.
I like, in theory, the fact that it becomes a lot more personal, and it really is just Tony versus Cap with the Winter Soldier between them, which is sort of on a bigger scale what the whole movie is. But I also just feel like it slowed down a lot, and it got a little bit too convoluted and stuff, especially coming off this great peak of the airport fight scene. I thought, it's a lot of falling action after that. And this movie had a little bit of the same issue that Age of Ultron had for me, which was a big issue for me, which is that it still does feel like setup, because it doesn't have that sort of neat bow at the end, and it ends with Cap essentially, I don't know, maybe forming Secret Avengers or something like that, but still saying, we're going off, we're going to be off the grid, we're going to do our own thing as our own team, you're going to do your thing, and that, but still leaves it open. To me, I'm like, okay, this is still just setting up when they inevitably come together in Infinity War. I didn't feel like there was a period at the end of this story. I felt it was more of a comma, and that bothered me a little bit, and it really, over the time, bothered me about Age of Ultron, the fact that that movie just seemed like a conduit movie to set up Thor Ragnarok and this movie and everything else. As
someone who agrees with you on Age of Ultron having those issues, and I just rewatched it last weekend, I didn't feel it nearly as much on this. I agree with the Accords, they needed more closure on that, but I still thought the ending is, of course we know that there's more movies, of course we know they're going to have to team up to stop Thanos.
Maybe I'm just too excited for Infinity War.
But I still think the end of this movie still is I guess that's why, going back to Zemo even, he succeeded in Iron Man and Captain America are no longer teammates. The fact that Captain America is totally off the grid, has to break his friends out, and they're going to go off to have their own adventures, I still think does give closure to this story in that sense. I just do think that the idea of the Accords themselves and how will this affect, what we assume now is Iron Man's Avengers versus Cap's, off the grid Avengers, how will that affect things, I think could have used a little more. But I still think it works as its own movie in the grand scheme of the split between Cap and Iron Man. You know?
Let's dive into the biggest change from the Civil War comic book to this movie. And this is getting into Civil War comic spoilers. This is
As I've been doing
warning.
the whole time without a warning.
I know, but this is the big one, right?
Yeah.
This is the big one. At the end of the Civil War comics, Captain America dies.
Yeah, it's worth knowing that it actually happens in his
After,
solo
yeah. I was gonna
series
say that.
right after Civil War,
But
it is part
everyone
of the
has it
Civil
in.
War arc, so you're good.
And
yeah.
there's no major death in this movie. Peggy Carter passes away, which is very sad.
Oh, yeah.
But also, I know
Why
you were
did you
saying no
bring that
death, and I
up?
was like, Peggy Carter. She is, 100, has dementia. It's
Yeah.
it's not a surprising death.
She
It's
lived
still
a
an
good
upsetting
life.
death.
It's just that she's so important and
I know.
cool.
Yeah, she's amazing. But there's no main Avenger death in this movie. And I had a chance to talk to the screenwriters. Like I mentioned in that interview, will be coming out on Saturday, the Saturday of opening release. So make sure you check it out. But I asked them, I was like, why did you change that from the comics? And they said it was because a big death like that would bring everyone together. And they didn't want to bring everyone back together at the end of this movie. That being said, what did you think about the change? Were you guys okay with it?
Yeah, I actually thought it worked just fine. I mean, as much as I'm intrigued by down the line the idea of, because that of course in the comics, they kept Cap dead for a while. It's comics, so you always have to say they kept him dead for a while, and that's when Bucky became the new Cap. That'd be interesting down the line, but I didn't think the movie needed it, and in fact, instead having it be, and we should mention in the comics, he's killed after he is arrested. That's how the Civil War ends, is Captain America arrested, basically.
Yeah, he gives up.
He gives up, yeah. But instead to have it be the physical consequences of Rhodey paralyzed, but then the bigger consequence of the fact that Cap and Hawkeye and Falcon, I know Ant-Man's there with him, but he was never an Avenger, but those guys are completely off on
Doesn't
their
count
own.
as an Avenger now.
Yeah,
It's not
yeah.
technically.
The fact that the team is split, I think works just fine. I didn't think the movie was lacking by not killing anyone, and in fact, I felt it kind of proves you don't need to have someone die to be the thing at the end.
I think people were expecting it to happen too, so it's better that it
Right.
didn't. But Joshua, do you have any different thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like it didn't need to have him die, although I felt by the end, especially with that letter, after going through this war and have this horrible personal falling out, to have it end on such a positive note, I was a little this doesn't feel quite right to me. But I do feel good knowing that Cap is still out there. He broke out his Avengers, and it sounds like he's gonna have his own sort of team. And they are split, but because again we didn't get that resolution on Sokovia Accords, I don't feel like I understand exactly where the lines are and what the world is going to be like with an off the grid team of Avengers and a normal team of Avengers. I think that would have been better, because I feel like eventually, I guess in Infinity War, we're going to see them battling separate threats, and then they'll eventually have to come
Right.
together. But if I don't have a clear line of just how separate they are, I don't really understand it. But as far as him not dying, I guess I really thought he was gonna die, because I had this, I guess it's now all fan fiction inside my head of just oh yeah, Cap is gonna die, and then in Infinity War, Bucky's gonna be Captain America like in the comic books, with the shield and the gun and the black suit, and then he was gonna lead a team of Avengers and then fail, and then they were all gonna get wiped out by the Infinity Gauntlet, and then that Captain America was gonna be dead, but because the lines between life and death would be blurred because of the Infinity Gauntlet, he would come back with a team of all the other Avengers who died. And he'd be
Joshua, did you write the next phase of the MCU?
And then he would finally
Here's
say,
my script.
He would finally say, "Avengers assemble!" as he's leading this giant team of dead Avengers back to life.
This just reminds me of that Patton Oswalt filibuster in Parks and Recreation, where sometimes I need to remind myself that that's not actually what's going to happen.
Right.
I'm curious. We're going to have to come back to this when Infinity War Parts 1 and 2 come out and see how close you
This
actually
was
are.
Joshua.
Because don't forget, Tony Stark had that vision that showed everyone strewn dead in this gaping hole up into the galaxy, and that's sort of what prompted everything in Age of Ultron, which to me is a vision of what's to come.
Yeah.
I have a
Yeah.
feeling we'll probably see something similar to that shot in Infinity War.
And I just have to say, I forgot to say Scarlet Witch. So he's breaking out. She would be one of the ones he's breaking out to. So.
How dare you? Everyone in the comments would yell at me.
Speaking of her, really quick, her and Vision finally got some time together.
And Vision in a sweater
Yes.
is like A+.
Yes,
God,
I love
he
it.
had great moments too. I mean,
He did.
again, that's where I'm so impressed by this movie is
I want
because
him
it
to
could have
release
felt
his recipe. Like, I think it was so good.
it could have felt like just so like nonsense, and instead these characters all got really nice moments. You know, it's like,
Yeah.
oh wow, the Vision and Scarlet Witch. There's some definite character building there.
And he very subtly just reminded us about the Infinity Stone inside
Right.
his head without, it wasn't
but
like
it was about him.
Yeah, it wasn't a Thor bath scene.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, it was much better integrated into the movie.
We all are agreed that every character had a great moment in this movie. But we did have some mixed thoughts, some of us more than others, about this movie. But looking at Civil War as a whole, what are your thoughts on this movie? Is this one of your favorites? Is it low on the list?
I would say I had the time of my life.
I was next to you. I can vouch for you.
For the first 2/3 of it. And like I said, I didn't like the ending. I didn't love the villain in the end. But overall, I'm going to go see it again. Not as many times as Eric probably. But
sees movies a
I'll
lot.
probably see it a couple more times.
I like the
And I feel like it'll all sit better now that I know like what to expect. But it definitely was a thrilling like superhero movie. The kind of thing I never thought I would ever see. It's definitely in my like top 5. I know like right now my favorite is Iron Man, then the Avengers, Guardians of the Galaxy, Winter Soldier, and it's somewhere in there, maybe better than Winter Soldier, I'd say. But right now that's where it is. Don't set me in stone, internet. But that's how I feel. I really liked it. I think it's great. I think everyone should go see it. And it was definitely better than that other fighting superhero movie that came out this summer.
Don't even. Why would you open up that can of
Fighting
worms?
superhero movie you're talking about.
Deadpool was great.
Deadpool was great. Now,
He did fight superheroes. He fought Colossus and
right.
Warhead.
Yeah, I freaking loved it. No, I was so happy because, as much as I was excited for this movie, there still was that concern. There's always going to be that concern. Infinity War will have that concern again of the overload factor and how much is too much. As great as it is on paper to say, put them all in, it could be a disaster. And I thought this movie was a really, really impressive accomplishment. There are some things I wish were done a little differently. But overall, it worked for me, and I was just so it was just such a sort of dream come true watching so much of it, and it's one of my favorites. I actually think Winter Soldier is still my definitive favorite MCU movie. I just think as a movie, it's just sort of just locked in on every sense. But this is up there. This is like one of maybe top 3 for me. As going back to what we were saying about the airport scene, just on spectacle alone, but without being like just spectacle. Like it's one thing to say, oh, they had a great action scene, but there was nothing to this movie. Like there's substantive stuff to this.
Marcus and McFeely, who are the screenwriters, had this quote in another interview, and what they said is the Russos told them that action without emotion or story is just porn. Is along the lines, and I feel like you can see that as a through line through here. Like every great set piece has a heart behind it and has a story behind it, and that's the thing. I'm excited to go back and see it again. I'm with you, Joshua. I'll probably go see it again this weekend. I'm excited to see, now that I know the story, what those character moments are, and let those really sort of like let me live in those moments. Because to me, that was my favorite part of this movie. I also maybe I'll come around a little bit on the ending. It did lose me a little bit when I saw it the first time, but I agree. I think it's number 5 for me. Guardians is my favorite. That movie is crazy and bananas, and I love that it got made. Then probably Winter Soldier, Avengers, or Iron Man, and this one. But I do think it's a great sign of things to come. It's a much stronger movie than some other Marvel movies that we've seen made. I think it's great that Cap movies are just so good. We have Iron Man and we have Captain America as our 2 main heroes within this franchise. And to see that these movies are consistently strong really excites me, especially since we know, well, hopefully Cap will come back again before Infinity War, but we know we'll get more Tony Stark next year in Spider-Man.
Yeah, I think it just also really underlined what a great choice the Russos ended up being. I mean, with which Winter Soldier already were like, oh man, they just nailed it. But you just watch them deal with all these characters, and they clearly have affection for these characters. And that's another thing I did a Civil War prep this weekend, and I watched the 2 Avengers movies and the 2 Cap movies, and I tweeted about it. It's again, it comes back to the characters and the fact that we love these characters. They're so likable and interesting, and that you can have the opening scenes of this movie where they're just sitting around a table arguing. but you're invested because it's like you care about these characters. And like you were saying, it really does inform the action in this movie. And some of that's humorous, and some of it's just, Winter Soldier knocking a guy off a bike, and it's awesome.
Yeah.
And I didn't really even say this earlier, but I do love the fact that like it's so Cap's movie because Tony had his big movie in Age of Ultron. And yes, if you just walk in and just watch this movie, his motivations might seem mostly informed by this woman who came and said that her son died. But we know he already had those concerns weighing on his shoulders in Age of Ultron. So I think it was just such a smart way to bring over that development that already happened, not feel the need to overdo it again, and thus you get this great conflict that feels earned between these two characters while also getting it to be Cap's movie.
Yeah. And I'll say the characters are so good they can have another movie that yet again has an awful villain and it'll still work great. It's like the thing of Marvel movies. Great characters, horrible villains, still great movie.
It wasn't horrible.
Except they need more time, like the Netflix series.
Yeah.
This is my favorite part that we're getting to of this conversation. This is what I've been waiting for the whole time. Let's speculate on what's going to come next. You guys have been talking a lot about secret Avengers, whether or not we're going to see some more of Cap and have them sort of do these, I don't know, side missions. I'm curious, like, where do you think those would fall if they are going to do that within the MCU movies we know are coming?
Yeah, it's interesting because we'd assume for a long time that Chris Evans, because Chris Evans, just going in was like, he talked openly about being hesitant when he signed the deal to do these movies, and he only, I know it's funny to say, only signed for 6 movies, but a lot of the other cast members were signing 9-picture deals, and he only did 6. And the fact is that now he's revealed he's changed his deal enough that he's in both the Avengers movies, whatever they call them, now that it's not going to be Infinity War Part 1 and 2. So right now, I assume we're not going to see Cap until the next Avengers movie, but who knows? I mean, maybe he could have a small role in Black Panther. We talked about Winter Soldier seeming likely now to pop up in Black Panther. Maybe Cap could too, but if nothing else, I feel like they have enough characters and enough interweaving that we could get updates on what's happening.
Right.
And it's it could be, just in one of these movies, someone does show up who's sort of attached to this world. You've got everyone from the fact of Hawkeye, but Sharon Carter and all these sort of conduits. So I think that we're going to get maybe some updates on what's happening along the way, even if we don't see Captain America himself on screen till Avengers, which is still what most likely to me. But not only would I love to be pleasantly surprised, but I think the chances seem likelier now than it did a couple years ago that maybe Chris Evans would be like, sure. I'll pop up in, Guardians 2 is a bad example. But
I don't know, Captain Marvel or Black Panther or something like that. We still aren't quite sure what they're doing with Captain Marvel, whether she's going to be, I don't know, cosmic or earthbound or what have you. Were there any other parts of this movie that got you really excited for movies yet to come? We obviously had the Spider-Man and Black Panther post-credit teases that gave us a little bit of a hint of what might come next there.
Things that are coming next. I don't know. I feel like in other movies we will maybe we'll hear about what the secret Avengers are up to, but we won't actually see them, kind of like you're saying. I could see that happening because when else would we see a full team of Avengers assembled, Iron Man's or Captain America's, until we get to Infinity War?
That's when I got to that part in the movie, my first thought was, okay, we will get the reunion at some point in Infinity War. But I do like that this movie restrained itself from too heavily setting things up. I think that was the biggest problem with Age of Ultron, which is that it was serving too many masters and it was setting up all these other things. That said, I'm always down for a good Thanos reference. I'm always down for a good check-in with that side of the universe.
Yeah, it's just if you do it well. That's the problem with the Thor subplot in Age of Ultron is it just felt it was not naturally part of the movie, right? It just felt like I'm gonna go and have some setup for my next movie,
Right.
But there's a way to do that. Like we were saying, the Vision scene is a great example of he's bringing up the stone and the fact that he doesn't understand it all, but it's all about him in this moment connecting with Scarlet Witch, so it didn't feel I
remember this.
It is that too, but you can do both more deftly than Age of Ultron did it.
Speaking of Scarlet Witch, one thing I think they might be setting up is something to do with Avengers Disassembled, even though they just disassembled the Avengers. But I feel post Infinity War, if they keep building on this idea of Scarlet Witch getting very powerful and not having complete control over it. I feel like they could do that storyline. For those who don't know, try not to do huge spoilers, but she loses control of her. This is a huge spoiler.
She Dark Phoenixes.
Yeah, she Dark Phoenixes. She loses control of her powers and accidentally kills some of the Avengers, destroys the mansion, and then the Avengers like disassemble. They splinter. They eventually have to reform. A new crisis happens later on, and then she actually
not a DC crisis.
Yeah, and eventually she actually like remakes the world in a perfect vision because she's a mutant in the comic books, or she was, not anymore. And this is the storyline called House of M, but obviously they can't do that because Fox owns the X-Men.
Well, we'll see who owns what by the time we get to that point.
Like in a Phase 4 movie, that could be it. Like an Avengers disassembled based around the Scarlet Witch losing control of her powers, remaking the world, and we can sort of see what everyone's like fantasy dream life is because she gives every character they want so they'll stop fighting. But then it all goes wrong, of course, as scenarios like that often do. So I feel like that I got a lot of strong Avengers disassembled vibe from Scarlet Witch for this. So I feel like that's one thing they could be setting up longer term, even to past Infinity War.
Yeah, and of course, a lot will depend on what happens in these Avengers movies. Because I was even thinking like, oh, well, when Ant-Man and the Wasp happens, is Scott Lang like on the run? You know, because at the end of this movie, Cap is breaking them all out.
That's true. That could be another movie that they check back in.
Right, but that's coming out right after the next Avengers movie. I'm trying to. I don't know if it's going to be called Infinity War, but so by the end of that movie, you know, will that be done? Will they no longer be fugitives, or will they still be fugitives, and they'll have to sort of deal with the fallout there? I definitely think this means, though, by the next Ant-Man movie, now that he's way more connected, both through Falcon and now with Cap and all these guys, that Ant-Man and the Wasp will probably have an Avenger or two, you know, pop up.
Yeah,
as well.
I think that it's sort of at the point where it's hard to imagine a lot of these movies not having it. Maybe Doctor Strange, which was, you know, as Civil War was setting up other movies, it sort of looked over Doctor Strange because we haven't been introduced to him yet. And we're getting more of the quantum realm there and magic and that side of the MCU. I'm very curious if we see anyone pop up in that movie. Or I know it's not like an origin movie, or if it feels a lot more standalone.
I think it will. My guess is that movie feels much more standalone, but then a post-credit scene they haven't shot yet, because a lot of times they'll do that, like will probably include a much more like meet so-and-so.
Yeah. Man, I'm just so giddy that the movies are now the same as the comic book shelf, where any hero from any like franchise or team can appear in another hero's story. Like I just read a comic book with, you know, Wolverine went and visited Doctor Strange. Well, obviously that wouldn't happen in here, obviously because of movie rights, but just the idea that like, you know, Hulk is probably going to be a part of the Thor movie, and that, you know, we have Ant-Man and the Wasp, but we know we're probably going to see some Avengers in there. So it's just fully developed world, and it just makes me so happy that they're all these different heroes get to like play in each other's like sandboxes. Because it used to be just like one hero, that's it. But we're way past that, and it's so exciting. Also, you were just talking about Ant-Man and the Wasp, and all I could think of was all Paul Rudd's like hilarious lines. Like there's he say like Mr. Captain America.
Yeah.
He's hysterical.
So we are
great.
so excited about what is yet to come in Phase 3 and beyond. Were you guys getting some Secret Adventures vibes, maybe some House of M vibes? Let us know in the comments. All right, before we go, let's talk about some box office predictions. I'm going to rattle off some numbers for you, a lot of numbers. So looking back at the MCU opening weekends, the biggest MCU movie that opened, and the only MCU movie that made over $200 million its opening weekend, was the first Avengers, and it made $207 million opening weekend. Age of Ultron came behind it with $191 million opening weekend, didn't quite crest 200. Then in terms of Cap movies, The Winter Soldier opened with $95 million, and the first Avenger opened with $65 million. Now between those two Avengers movies and two Captain America movies are all three Iron Man movies. They've all opened really well, performed really well. This Civil War sort of has the perfect combination of all of it. It's not an Avengers movie, but it has probably more Avengers than Age of Ultron. It has Tony Stark in it, so it has that Iron Man boost. So my question, and then also, Captain America Civil War has already been open for a week worldwide, and already it's made $261 million, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
So with all those numbers now inside your head, my question to you guys is, do you think that Civil War will open to more than $200 million?
I think it will. I just think it has everything going for it, because it's, you know, like you said, it's almost an Avengers movie. It certainly has a bunch of Avengers that are in the posters and trailers and are really a prominent part of this movie. Most notably Iron Man. It's just like he's a huge movie star character on his own. Iron Man 3 was a giant hit. But also, it's coming off Winter Soldier. It's the sequel to such a well-received movie. And the Cap movies doubled. Winter Soldier doubled what First Avenger made and is such a well-regarded film. So it's it's got all of that. And this is a very well-reviewed movie. It's getting great reviews, great buzz. So I think there's just so many reasons that people are excited. And I think it is tracking around 190 to 200 million, but I think it's going to make a 200 million or above opening weekend, just because I think, it's just primed. People were already excited. They're excited about what they see in the posters and trailers, and then people are telling them it's a good movie. Critics are telling them that. So I think it's gonna be a bigger opening than Age of Ultron, is what I definitely think.
Yeah, I would reiterate all that plus Spider-Man.
I know Spider-Man and Black Panther. I think
Black
Spider-Man is the big selling point though, and they've really undersold him in the promotion. I have a feeling once this movie comes out, we're gonna see a bit more Spidey in the promos that air on TV.
I don't know. I'm not good at choosing specific numbers, but I almost think it has what it takes to beat the first Avengers movie. I almost wonder if it's going to do 211.
Yeah. That would beat the first Avengers movie. I agree with you. I'm interested to see if it grows, if audiences respond well to it, and also, looking beyond opening weekend, if people will come back for repeat viewings, because I think that's the thing that kills some of these movies that open so big, but people don't have the drive to go back and see it again. I mean, Eric obviously is going back and seeing it multiple times within the next few days. I'm planning on going back and bringing my friends and family to go see it. Joshua, you are as well, but I'm curious.
I don't have any friends, but I'll be going.
Just family, just yourself.
No, and I think it will have that repeat business, and Spider-Man, is really important here because. Yeah, like you said, it's he's only at the end of that one trailer. There was one TV ad that showed the same bit but extended. And so I think a lot of people are going to go see this movie and not even realize he's in it. And or forget he's in it. And they'll be so excited by him and his presence. And we have to remember children. There's a lot of them. Spider-Man is a huge character with kids.
This is for adults.
Huge character with kids. He's one of the best-selling merchandise every year. And I was saying, as amazing as that airport sequence was for us, I'm if I saw it when I was 10. I think I would die. But if I didn't die, I would have to see that movie 50 times.
Yeah.
And I think Spider-Man, will get so many people talking, both in the boardrooms and the playgrounds, and the fact that I think the movie overall will be very well received, and a movie that people will want to see. Oh, I want to see that sequence again. In the long run, I think that this is the one to beat this year.
The first thing I wanted to do as soon as I got out was see it again.
Yeah.
And I don't actually see movies multiple times in theaters, unless it's a special case, and this is definitely one of those cases.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited to see it again. Well, we want to hear your box office predictions. Let us know if you think that Civil War will make more than 200 million or even beat the Avengers in the comments below. You can follow all of us on Twitter. I am at Terri_Schwartz. Eric is at the Eric Goldman, and Joshua is at Joshua Yale. And you can find us basically on any screen that you have. In addition to IGN.com and our mobile site, we have an iOS and Android app. You can find us on Roku. You can find us on PS4. So if you have a device that's not your computer or your phone, check us out. We're probably on there. We love talking comic book movies, Marvel, and otherwise. So for all things comics and film and TV, keep it here at IGN.